The story begins long before the 2003 war. Our first piece of evidence comes from April 3rd, 1991. It is the mandate for the United Nations Special Commission, better known as UNSCOM. The Commission's mandate under Security Council Resolution 687 is the following. Number 1, to carry out immediate on-site inspection of Iraq's biological, chemical, and missile capabilities. Number 2, to take possession for destruction, removal, or rendering harmless of all chemical and biological weapons, all stocks of agents and all related subsystems and components, and all research, development, support, and manufacturing facilities. And number 3, UNSCOM is charged with supervising the destruction by Iraq of all its ballistic missiles. These are the Scud missiles, which caused so much worry during the first Gulf War in 1990-91. Supervise the destruction by Iraq of all its ballistic missiles with a range greater than 150 kilometers. That's approximately about 90 miles. And related major parts and repair and production facilities. UNSCOM is also meant to monitor and verify Iraq's compliance with its undertaking not to use, develop, construct, or acquire any of the items specified above, such as biological, chemical, or missile technology with a range in excess of 150 kilometers or about 90 miles. UNSCOM. Our next piece of evidence concerns those very chemical and biological weapons, CBWs. Here we have yet another CRS report, Congressional Research Service report, dated 17 February 1998. Quote, in April 1991, the United Nations Security Council established the ceasefire conditions for the conflict in the Persian Gulf. Iraq accepted Security Council Resolution 687. Remember that number, Security Council Resolution 687. It's going to come up again and again. Which required the destruction or neutralization of, number 1, all chemical, nuclear, and biological weapons. Number 2, all ballistic missiles with a range of over 150 kilometers or 90 miles. SRC, that's Security Council Resolution 687, also prohibited Iraq from future development, production, or use of such weapons in the future. Subsequent Security Council Resolution 715 established the United Nations Special Commission, UNSCOM, which we just saw the mandate for, to monitor and verify Iraqi compliance with these disarmament requirements. This is 17 February 1998. This report goes on to say that since 1991, UNSCOM inspectors in Iraq have destroyed 38,000 chemical munitions, 480,000 liters of chemical warfare agents, 48 ballistic missiles, these would be Scud missiles, 6 missile launchers, and 30 chemical biological weapon missile warheads. This is a CRS report, 17 February 1998. Moreover, in this report, we see that, quote, British intelligence believe that up to 10 Scud missiles capable of carrying chemical or biological warheads remain hidden. UNSCOM reports that 40 to 70 chemical or biological weapon capable missile warheads are unaccounted for. Iraq possessed the capacity to produce over 16,000 liters of anthrax spores that have been acknowledged. 4,000 tons of chemical weapon precursor chemicals are unaccounted for. 31,000 chemical weapons munitions remain unaccounted for. Finally, it is believed that Iraq may retain undetermined amounts of Ebola virus, bubonic and pneumonic plague bacteria, and the toxin ricin. So what we have in this report is progress with caution. There is still a lot out there that UNSCOM has not gotten to 7 years later. The policy during the decade of the 1990s can be summed up in one word: containment. If we look at another CRS report, this one, the day of the election, 2000, the presidential election, CRS report on the Persian Gulf. It tells us that, quote, in May 1993, the Clinton administration articulated a policy of dual containment of Iran and Iraq. The Clinton administration explained the policy as an effort to keep both Iran and Iraq strategically weak simultaneously, in contrast to past policies that sought to support either Iran or Iraq as a counterweight to the other. We, of course, know what those policies were. During the 1980s, we supported Saddam Hussein, but in a certain sense we also supported the Iranian regime in the infamous Iran-Contra arms sales scandal, something that we unfortunately didn't have time to talk about. The Clinton administration is taking a different approach here, a policy of dual containment, keeping both countries strategically weak. A little less than a year later, we have another CRS report, this one on Iraqi compliance. Dated 23 August 2001, 3 weeks before 9/11, this report tells us that, quote, the Clinton administration's position was that major military action against Iraq could be taken if Iraq is known to have rebuilt weapons of mass destruction, if it threatens its neighbors, or if Iraq attacks the Kurdish enclave. This would be in northern Iraq. Indications are that Bush administration criteria for major military action differ little, if at all. During March 2000 to March 2001, Iraqi air defenses fired at Allied aircraft, enforcing the zones on 500 occasions. The zones here are the no-fly zones, indicated on this map as the northern NFZ to protect the Kurds, and the southern NFZ, southern no-fly zone, to protect the Shia majority. 500 firings in the course of 1 year. Now, most of these firings were from anti-aircraft guns, not from missiles. This report goes on to tell us that from the end of the Gulf War until the end of fiscal year 2000, the Department of Defense has incurred about $8 billion in costs to contain Iraq and provide humanitarian aid to the Kurds. I'm going to read that sentence for you one more time. From 1991 to the year 2000, the Department of Defense spent $8 billion in Iraq. 2003 until 2009, the Department of Defense has spent approximately $1 trillion in Iraq, but that's for the last lecture. Of that $8 billion, about $1.14 billion was spent in fiscal year 2000. The Clinton administration estimated that $1.1 billion would be spent in fiscal year 2001. November of 1998, roughly at the same time as the cruise missile strikes into Afghanistan and into the Sudan, and of course, roughly the same time as the Monica Lewinsky scandal, the Clinton administration launched Operation Desert Fox, 4 days of aerial bombardment of Iraqi air defense sites in response to their continued attempts to shoot down, fire at Allied aircraft. We also see in this report the fact that on December 18, 1998, not long after Operation Desert Fox, UNSCOM inspectors were expelled from the country. This is from a State Department report on Saddam Hussein's Iraq, dated September 1999. In it, we find that Saddam Hussein has systematically plundered his country since his 1979 rise to power, and despite massive economic sanctions against him, Saddam Hussein was able to spend lavishly during the 1990s. At the same time, millions of people inside the country were starving to death. What we see here now is a satellite photograph of Saddamiyat al-Tartar. Located 85 miles west of Baghdad, this sprawling lakeside vacation resort contains stadiums, an amusement park, hospitals, parks, and 625 homes to be used by government officials. The project costing hundreds of millions of dollars at the same time, while millions of Iraqis are starving. This report goes on to find that Saddam Hussein is forcibly relocating Shia populations around the city of Basra and the southern marshes, causing grave environmental danger. He's murdering Shia clerics in the south, of course course, Saddam Hussein is Sunni. He is destroying villages and forcibly relocating people, both the Kurdish north and the Shia south, that he's committed war crimes, crimes against humanity. Moreover, while this repression of the Iraqi people continues, the Iraqi regime still is far from complying with its obligations under UN Security Council resolutions, such as Security Council Resolutions 687 and 715. It has not fully declared and destroyed its weapons of mass destruction programs. It has not responded fully to questions from UNSCOM and the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. This is all in the State Department report on Hussein's Iraq, dated September 1999. Of course, between September 1999 and November 2000 and August 2001, something happened. 9/11 happened. What we're going to watch now is President George W. Bush giving the State of the Union address, the first State of the Union address following the September 11th attacks, the date 29 January 2002.
We last met in an hour of shock and suffering. In 4 short months, our nation has comforted the victims, begun to rebuild New York and the Pentagon, rallied a great coalition, captured, arrested, and rid the world of thousands of terrorists, destroyed Afghanistan's terrorist training camps, saved the people from starvation, and freed a country from brutal oppression. The American flag flies again over our embassy in Kabul. Terrorists who once occupied Afghanistan now occupy cells at Guantanamo Bay. And terrorist leaders who urged followers to sacrifice their lives are running for their own. America and Afghanistan are now allies against terror. We'll be partners in rebuilding that country. And this evening, we welcomed the distinguished interim leader of a liberated Afghanistan, Chairman Hamid Karzai. Our progress is a tribute to the spirit of the Afghan people, to the resolve of our coalition, and to the might of the United States military. So long as training camps operate, so long as nations harbor terrorists, freedom is at risk, and America and our allies must not and will not allow it. Our nation will continue to be steadfast and patient and persistent in the pursuit of 2 great objectives. First, we will shut down terrorist camps, disrupt terrorist plans, and bring terrorists to justice. And second, we must prevent the terrorists and regimes who seek chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons from threatening the United States and the world. Our military has put the terror training camps of Afghanistan out of business. Yet camps still exist in at least a dozen countries. A terrorist underworld, including groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Jaish-e-Mohammed, operates in remote jungles and deserts and hides in the centers of large cities. Our second goal is to prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction. Some of these regimes have been pretty quiet since September the 11th, but we know their true nature. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred. They could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States. In any of these cases, the price of indifference would be catastrophic. We will work closely with our coalition to deny terrorists and their state sponsors the materials, technology, and expertise to make and deliver weapons of mass destruction. We will develop and deploy effective missile defenses to protect America and our allies from sudden attack. And all nations should know America will do what is necessary to ensure our nation's security. We'll be deliberate, yet time is not on our side. I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
But some governments will be timid in the face of terror, and make no mistake about it. If they do not act, America will. Some of these regimes are pretty quiet since September the 11th. We know their true nature. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that has agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons. So is born the Axis of Evil, 29 January 2002. Less than 6 months have passed since September the 11th. And as we've already seen, two of the most surprised people to be included in the axis of evil were President Khatami and Vice President Atahi of Iran. After all, in January of 2002, Iran was helping American forces make deals with the Northern Alliance against our common enemy, the Sunni Taliban. During the course of 2002, the war rhetoric was ramped up.
The United States knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Any country on the face of the earth with an active intelligence program knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
There is no doubt Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
The choice is his. And if he does not disarm, the United States of America will lead a coalition and disarm him in the name of peace.
By the beginning of 2003, war rhetoric had reached a fevered pitch. And on the 28th of January 2003, 1 year after coining the phrase, the axis of evil, President George W. Bush returned to Congress for his second State of the Union address after the attacks of 9/11. Let's go to the tape.
Our nation and the world must learn the lessons of the Korean Peninsula and not allow an even greater threat to rise up in Iraq. A brutal dictator with a history of reckless aggression, with ties to terrorism, with great potential wealth, will not be permitted to dominate a vital region and threaten the United States. 12 years ago, Saddam Hussein faced the prospect of being the last casualty in a war he had started and lost. To spare himself, he agreed to disarm of all weapons of mass destruction. For the next 12 years, he systematically violated that agreement. He pursued chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, even while inspectors in his country. Nothing to date has restrained him from his pursuit of these weapons. Not economic sanctions, not isolation from the civilized world, not even cruise missile strikes on his military facilities. Almost 3 months ago, the United Nations Security Council gave Saddam Hussein his final chance to disarm. He has shown instead utter contempt for the United Nations and for the opinion of the world. The 108 UN inspectors were not sent to conduct a scavenger hunt for hidden materials across a country the size of California. The job of the inspectors is to verify that Iraq's regime is disarming. It is up to Iraq to show exactly where it is hiding its banned weapons, lay those weapons out for the world to see, and destroy them as directed. Nothing like this has happened. The United Nations concluded in 1999 that Saddam Hussein had biological weapons sufficient to produce over 25,000 liters of anthrax, enough doses to kill several million people. He hasn't accounted for that material. He has given no evidence that he has destroyed it. The United Nations concluded that Saddam Hussein had material sufficient to produce more than 38,000 liters of botulinum toxin, enough to subject millions of people to death by respiratory failure. He hadn't accounted for that material. He's given no evidence that he has destroyed it. Our intelligence officials estimate that Saddam Hussein had the materials to produce as much as 500 tons of sarin, mustard, and VX nerve agent. In such quantities, these chemical agents could also kill untold thousands. He's not accounted for these materials. He has given no evidence that he has destroyed them. U.S. intelligence indicates that Saddam Hussein had upwards of 30,000 munitions capable of delivering chemical agents. Inspectors recently turned up 16 of them, despite Iraq's recent declaration denying their existence. Saddam Hussein has not accounted for the remaining 29,984 of these prohibited munitions. He has given no evidence that he has destroyed them. From 3 Iraqi defectors, we know that Iraq in the late 1990s had several mobile biological weapons labs. These are designed to produce germ warfare agents and can be moved from place to place to evade inspectors. Saddam Hussein has not disclosed these facilities. He's given no evidence that he has destroyed them. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed in the 1990s that Saddam Hussein had an advanced nuclear weapons development program, had a design for a nuclear weapon, and was working on 5 different methods of enriching uranium for a bomb. The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. Our intelligence sources tell us that he has attempted to purchase high-strength aluminum tubes suitable for nuclear weapons production. Saddam Hussein has not credibly explained these activities. He clearly has much to hide. The dictator of Iraq is not disarming. To the contrary, he is deceiving. From intelligence sources, we know, for instance, that thousands of Iraqi security personnel are at work hiding documents and materials from the UN inspectors, sanitizing inspection sites, and monitoring the inspectors themselves. Iraqi officials accompany the inspectors in order to intimidate witnesses. Iraq is blocking U-2 surveillance flights requested by the United Nations. Iraqi intelligence officers are posing as the scientists inspectors are supposed to interview. Real scientists have been coached by Iraqi officials on what to say. Intelligence sources indicate that Saddam Hussein has ordered that scientists who cooperate with UN inspectors in disarming Iraq will be killed, along with their families. Year after year, Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths, spent enormous sums, taken great risks to build and keep weapons of mass destruction. But why? The only possible explanation, the only possible use he could have for those weapons is to dominate, intimidate, or attack. With nuclear arms, full arsenal of chemical and biological weapons, Saddam Hussein could resume his ambitions of conquest in the Middle East and create deadly havoc in that region. And this Congress and the American people must recognize another threat. Evidence from intelligence sources, secret communications, and statements by people now in custody reveal that Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda. Secretly and without fingerprints, he could provide one of his hidden weapons to terrorists or help them develop their own. Before September the 11th, many in the world believed that Saddam Hussein could be contained. But chemical agents, lethal viruses, and shadowy terrorist networks not easily contained. Imagine those 19 hijackers with other weapons and other plans, this time armed by Saddam Hussein. Take one vial, one canister, one crate, slipped into this country to bring a day of horror like none we have ever known. We will do everything in our power to make sure that day never comes. Some have said we must not act until the threat is imminent. Since when have terrorists and tyrants announced their intentions, politely putting us on notice before they strike? If this threat is permitted to fully and suddenly emerge, all actions, all words, and all recriminations would come too late. Trusting in the sanity and restraint of Saddam Hussein is not a strategy, and it is not an option. And tonight I have a message for the brave and oppressed people of Iraq. Your enemy is not surrounding your country. Your enemy is ruling your country. And the day he and his regime are removed from power will be the day of your liberation. The world has waited 12 years for Iraq to disarm. America will not accept a serious and mounting threat to our country and our friends and our allies. We will consult. But let there be no misunderstanding. If Saddam Hussein does not fully disarm, for the safety of our people and for the peace of the world, we will lead a coalition to disarm him.
One of the most worrisome things that emerges from the thick intelligence file we have on Iraq's biological weapons is the existence of mobile production facilities used to make biological agents. Let me take you inside that intelligence file and share with you what we know from eyewitness accounts. We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails. The trucks and train cars are easily moved and are designed to evade detection by inspectors. Confirmation came later, in the year 2000. The source was an eyewitness, an Iraqi chemical engineer who supervised one of these facilities. He actually was present during biological agent production runs. He was also at the site when an accident occurred in 1998. 12 technicians died from exposure to biological agents. He reported that when UNSCOM was in country and inspecting, the biological weapons agent production always began on Thursdays at midnight because Iraq thought UNSCOM would not inspect on the Muslim holy day, Thursday night through Friday. He added that this was important because the units could not be broken down in the middle of a production run, which had to be completed by Friday evening before the inspectors might arrive again. This defector is currently hiding in another country with a certain knowledge that Saddam Hussein will kill him if he finds him. His eyewitness account of these mobile production facilities has been corroborated by other sources. A second source, an Iraqi civil engineer in a position to know the details of the program, confirmed the existence of transportable facilities moving on trailers. A third source, also in a position to know, reported in summer 2002 that Iraq had manufactured mobile production systems mounted on road trailer units and on rail cars. Finally, a fourth source, an Iraqi major who defected, confirmed that Iraq has mobile biological research laboratories in addition to the production facilities I mentioned earlier. For example, Iraq had a program to modify aerial fuel tanks for Mirage jets. This video of an Iraqi test flight obtained by UNSCOM some years ago shows an Iraqi F-1 Mirage jet aircraft. Note the spray coming from beneath the Mirage. That is 2,000 liters of simulated anthrax that a jet spraying. In 1995, an Iraqi military officer, Mujahid Saleh Abdul Latif, told inspectors that Iraq intended the spray tanks to be mounted onto a MiG-21 that had been converted into an unmanned aerial vehicle, or a UAV. UAVs outfitted with spray tanks constitute an ideal method for launching a terrorist attack using biological weapons. There can be no doubt that Saddam Hussein has biological weapons and the capability to rapidly produce more, many more. and he has the ability to dispense these lethal poisons and diseases in ways that can cause massive death and destruction. If biological weapons seem too terrible to contemplate, chemical weapons are equally chilling. UNMOVIC already laid out much of this, and it is documented for all of us to read in INSCOM's 1999 report on the subject. If we consider just one category of missing weaponry, 6,500 bombs from the Iran-Iraq War, UNMOVIC says the amount of chemical agent in them would be in the order of 1,000 tons. These quantities of chemical weapons are now unaccounted for. Dr. Blick says, quipped that, quote, mustard gas is not marmalade. You are supposed to know what you did with it. We believe Saddam Hussein knows what he did with it, and he has not come clean with the international community. We have evidence these weapons existed. What we don't have is evidence from Iraq that they have been destroyed or where they are. That is what we are still waiting for. We know that Iraq has embedded key portions of its illicit chemical weapons infrastructure within its legitimate civilian industry. To all outward appearances, even experts, the infrastructure looks like an ordinary civilian operation. Illicit and legitimate production can go on simultaneously, or on a dime. This dual-use infrastructure can turn from clandestine to commercial and then back again. Our conservative estimate is that Iraq today has a stockpile of between 100 and 500 tons of chemical weapons agent. That is enough agent to fill 16,000 battlefield rocks. Even the low end of 100 tons of agent would enable Saddam Hussein to cause mass casualties across more than 100 square miles of territory, an area nearly 5 times the size of Manhattan. Let me turn now to nuclear weapons. We have no indication that Saddam Hussein has ever abandoned his nuclear weapons program. On the contrary, we have more than a decade of proof that he remains determined to acquire nuclear weapons. Fully appreciate the challenge that we face today. Remember that in 1991, the inspectors searched Iraq's primary nuclear weapons facilities for the first time, and they found nothing to conclude that Iraq had a nuclear weapons program. But based on defector information, in May of 1991, Saddam Hussein's lie was exposed. In truth, Saddam Hussein had a massive clandestine nuclear weapons program that covered several different techniques to enrich uranium, including electromagnetic isotope separation, gas centrifuge, and gas diffusion. We estimate that this illicit program cost the Iraqis several $billions. Nonetheless, Iraq continued to tell the IAEA that it had no nuclear weapons program. If Saddam had not been stopped, Iraq could have produced a nuclear bomb by 1993, years earlier than most worst-case assessments that have been made before the war. Saddam Hussein already possesses 2 out of the 3 key components needed to build a nuclear bomb. He has a cadre of nuclear scientists with the expertise, and he has a bomb design. Since 1998, his efforts to reconstitute his nuclear program have been focused on acquiring the third and last component, sufficient fissile material to produce a nuclear explosion. He is so determined that he has made repeated covert attempts to acquire high-specification aluminum tubes from 11 different countries, even after inspections resumed. These tubes are controlled by the Nuclear Suppliers Group precisely because they can be used as centrifuges for enriching uranium. Our concern is not just about these illicit weapons, it's the way that these illicit weapons can be connected to terrorists and terrorist organizations that have no compunction about using such devices against innocent people around the world. Iraq and terrorism go back decades. Baghdad trains Palestine Liberation Front members in small arms and explosives. Saddam uses the Arab Liberation Front to fund money to the families of Palestinian suicide bombers in order to prolong the Intifada. And it's no secret that Saddam's own intelligence service was involved in dozens of attacks or attempted assassinations in the 1990s. But what I want to bring to your attention today is the potentially much more sinister nexus between Iraq and the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, a nexus that combines classic terrorist organizations and modern methods of murder. Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda lieutenants. Zarqawi, a Palestinian born in Jordan, fought in the Afghan war more than a decade ago. Returning to Afghanistan in 2000, he oversaw a terrorist training camp. One of his specialties, and one of the specialties of this camp, is poisons. When our coalition ousted the Taliban, the Zarqawi network helped establish another poison and explosive training center camp, and this camp is located in northeastern Iraq. You see a picture of this camp. My colleagues, we have an obligation to our citizens. We have an obligation to this body to see that our resolutions are
Target Iraq. This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
The United States and Great Britain today gave up the idea of winning a second UN resolution authorizing war against Iraq. So tonight, President Bush will go on national television where he will deliver a final ultimatum to Saddam Hussein. Monday, March 17th, the battle lines were drawn.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing. Fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases to help with intelligence and logistics to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense. To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you. That trust is well placed. The enemies you confront will come to know your skill and bravery. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military. In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality. Saddam Hussein has placed Iraqi troops and equipment in civilian areas, attempting to use innocent men, women, and children as shields for his own military, a final atrocity against his people. I want Americans and all the world to know that coalition forces will make every effort to spare innocent civilians from harm. A campaign on the harsh terrain of a nation as large as California could be longer and more difficult than some predict. And helping Iraqis achieve a united, stable, and free country will require our sustained commitment. We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens, for their great civilization, and for the religious faiths they practice. We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people. I know that the families of our military are praying that all those who serve will return safely and soon. Millions of Americans are praying with you for the safety of your loved ones and for the protection of the innocent. For your sacrifice, you have the gratitude and respect of the American people. And you can know that our forces will be coming home as soon as their work is done. Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities. Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory. My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome. We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to us, and we will prevail. May God bless our country and all who defend her.
19th of March, 2003. That was 2,300 days ago. Put that in perspective. The Second World War lasted approximately 1,350 days for the United States. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, 1,450 days. Vietnam is the only war that has lasted longer than the war in Iraq. 2,300 days. The tragedy is, as we are going to see moving forward in these lectures, it wasn't supposed to turn out like this. It was not supposed to turn out like this at all. But in those early heady days of Operation Iraqi Freedom, the possibility that in 2009 we would still be struggling to put this country back together again would have seemed ridiculously pessimistic, alarmist. 21 days was all it took to go from the beginning to the end of major combat operations. But as we know, that was only the beginning. The beginning of what was going to be a war unlike any the United States had fought. There are echoes of Vietnam, but the brutality, the extensive use of suicide bombers, makes the violence in Vietnam in some ways seem tame by comparison. But again, in those early days, no one could have predicted. Rather, those are the days of shock and awe, when the power of the United States military, its technological superiority, was put on display for the entire world to see, and most importantly for Americans to watch in their living rooms at home. Let's go to the tape.
Good evening. Almost 48 hours into the battle, the war advances with startling speed tonight. This is the scene in Baghdad now, hours before daybreak on Saturday morning in that part of the world, hours after a dramatic attack in which the Pentagon has now called it unprecedented in its precision. Explosions, fireballs, shroom clouds, a fearsome display of American military might. On Friday, March 21st, air raid sirens split the night in Baghdad. This was shock and awe.
We felt the vibration of that one almost knocked me off my feet in the hotel room here. That was a major building in the presidential palace. Opposite 3 major buildings, 4, Tom, hit a mile away from us. You'll see the pictures now. There's considerable smoke. There were 4 buildings, 2 of them prized possessions of President Saddam Hussein. Again, more extreme that area. Again, the blast hitting us in the room here. We have our camera tied down. It could be something like this. Seems like cruise missiles probably, Tom, because there's no sounds of aircraft. The sky now black with smoke in front of us. Just across the Tigris River here, violent explosions. More. The sky lit up. huge explosions. Blowing apart the prized presidential compound of Saddam Hussein. Many of his major administrative buildings going up in smoke and fire, Tom. Again, another. Just disintegrating here. Bigger than the Gulf War, Tom, the first Gulf War, much bigger, these explosions. This is shock and awe, Tom, to the population of Baghdad. Shock and awe, indeed.
From his Baghdad hotel room, veteran war correspondent Peter Arnett had a frightening view of the punishing bombardment.
The main palace building gone up totally in smoke. Just all gone away, Tom. Just blown apart. We had a ringside view of right in front of us, these major buildings. Secondary explosions, more coming in. More, maybe they're secondary explosions. Every strike has the same devastating pattern. First the light, then the sound, and a powerful blast of hot air that nearly knocks us off our feet. Even though most targets are a mile away, I've never felt anything so intense. One building after another going down, Tom. Right in front of us, at least 10 major buildings destroyed, Tom, in the course of about 2 minutes. An amazing sight. Just like out of an action movie, but this is real. This is real. This is shock and awe, Tom.
500 to 600 cruise missiles from U.S. warships and Air Force B-52s, followed by waves of B-2 stealth bombers and stealth fighters, dropping 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs. And every weapon is precision-guided, deadly accuracy designed to kill only the target, not innocent civilians.
What is taking place today is as targeted an air campaign as has ever existed.
The night sky just lit up. There were cruise missiles in the sky, and it was an awesome sight.
With the night sky aglow, even in the southern Iraq desert, more ground forces charged across the Kuwait border.
Those armored formations are going to move very, very quickly. It wouldn't surprise me if the 3rd Infantry Division's lead elves have covered somewhere between 150 and 200 miles at this point.
Tom, we're just rolling along. It's nighttime now, obviously, here in Iraq. It's coming up on 9:10, 9:15 at night. So it's been almost 23 hours now since this force first crossed into southern. Large force, the 2nd Brigade of the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division. And they're just rolling along here, moving north toward Baghdad.
If you can just visualize this, it's pitch black out there. There's 1,000 or more armored vehicles, 3,000 or 4,000 wheeled vehicles. They're moving in complete blackout conditions, night vision goggles. And while they're moving, they're engaging enemy forces on the move and nailing them at 3,000 meters. They're the first army in history that actually knows where they are in the dark.
NBC's Brian Williams is in Kuwait City, where the sirens have been sounding again tonight. Brian, are the people of Kuwait able to watch the ground action as the American ground units begin to move north?
They are. The coverage, of course, being beamed globally. People in disbelief that with this war, the new marriage of technology, both militarily and in television, that they can watch the actual units, like David Bloom's, moving north through Iraq. And there is palpable excitement that this neighbor to the north, this tyrant, may not be a problem much longer.
But 2 days into the war, what impact would shock and awe truly have?
As we've seen plenty of shock and awe today, American commanders are convinced that's what it will take to spur the Iraqi people to action against Saddam Hussein. But NBC military analyst William Arkin warns that shock and awe can cut both ways. While Iraqis might turn on Saddam, making them a target, they could end up hating Americans more for dropping bombs.
All of the entire Desert Storm, 330 weapons landed on Baghdad in 43 days. Today, 330 weapons landed on Baghdad. And so you get a sense now of what they mean when they are saying shock.
NBC's Kelly O'Donnell is in Qatar, where Tommy Franks, the general in charge of all of this, is running the war from the U.S. Central Military Command. What's the report out of there today on the progress of the war so far, Kelly?
Good evening, Tom. Senior CENTCOM officials tell me that the air war is so far going as expected, and they say that the first real sign of assessment will come when daylight turns here not long from now, when they can get their first visual assessment of what has happened.
The ship is already gearing up to launch more air attacks tonight. The war plan is still fluid. However, tonight's assault is not expected to be as intense as the one we saw last night. One pilot described it this way: like a street fight. You punch hard, then you step back, see what the situation is before you decide to punch again.
Rapid series of 40 explosions lit up Baghdad in the early morning hours.
Military officials have been using the term shock and awe to describe the assault on Iraq.
Severe sandstorm.
Engaged in direct battle against Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard.
Soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division pushed past the city of Karbala, southwest of Baghdad.
It was over in 3 weeks. Saddam's army disappeared. So did Saddam.
Pivotal, and they set the stage for an assault on Baghdad expected to begin soon.
And so did Saddam's statue.
Hundreds of Iraqi civilians taken to the city streets, cheering U.S. soldiers and ripping up
The president watched efforts to pull down Saddam's statue.
History was made. This giant symbol of Saddam's regime was torn from its pedestal.
At the White House, they were quietly celebrating.
The White House was definitely a gloat-free zone, to use his term.
We had just seen the pictures of the statue come tumbling down. The president was very emotional and happy. Condoleezza Rice was there, and the vice president was there.
Condi Rice was ecstatic. There were tears in her eyes, and she was very moved by this.
Cheney has a dinner at the residence and has his chief aide, Scooter Libby, Wolfowitz, Ken Edelman, and Cheney's wife. And it's a kind of celebration that they'd done it. And they talked at that dinner about, we're going to find weapons of mass destruction, don't worry, you know, and it was a celebration.
Across Washington, the other architect of the war was also taking a victory lap.
The scenes of free Iraqis celebrating in the streets, riding American tanks, tearing down the statues of Saddam Hussein in the center of Baghdad are breathtaking.
People were just pure exhilaration. At that point in time, you think, this might just work. And I remember seeing a guy was carrying a huge couch on his back, and he turns and says, "Yay, America!"
There were flowers, there were shouts of joy, there were people clambering on the tanks and kissing the tank crews. But by the time this happened, and within a matter of an hour of the Marine tanks coming up the Canal Expressway, of course the looting had begun.
All of a sudden, the Iraqi people started looting, attacked the ministries, basically created a series of events which didn't stop with that. Less than 2 U.S. brigades were in isolated positions in a city of more than 5 million people, having no idea of what might come next.
This was not normal. It's not a sign of liberated people. I think it's a sign of people who sense there is no authority. Iraqis are used to military coups. When they take place, they tune into the radios and they obey orders, and people know exactly how to respond to it. Instead, there was a day, 2 days, and 3 days of no authority.
General James Conway commanded the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. They were smack in the middle of the looting.
If we had been told to stop the looting and secure the key elements of the city, we could have provided the force to do that.
Did you get on the phone and say, why aren't we defending these buildings? Why are we letting this country be looted?
Nope.
You didn't do that?
Nope.
When we questioned General McKiernan, 3rd Infantry Division commander, as to why there had been no greater attempt to impose order, he said Saddam, counting military and paramilitary, secret police and others, Saddam had 250,000 people to maintain order, and the U.S. military had arrived with 7,000.
You had no Iraqi institutions to co-opt into this. No Iraqi army, no Iraqi police, prisoners let out of prison, no local or national government organizations, ministries didn't exist.
Iraqis are looting on a grand scale. It is a clear sign that while war might be ending, there is trouble ahead.
Stuff happens. Freedom's untidy, and free people are free to make mistakes and commit crimes and do bad things. They're also free to live their lives and do wonderful things, and that's what's going to happen here.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone. We're going to begin at sea tonight. That's where the president is today. Mr. Bush did what lots of people would like to do. He flew from the California coast out to the aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is almost home. It is a very special feeling to land on a carrier. And it is from there tonight that the president is going to make what amounts to an end of the war in Iraq speech. And so first we go to the Abraham Lincoln and ABC's Bob Woodruff.
Peter, the president landed in a plane that is called a Viking S-3B. This is a plane that was originally designed to hunt for submarines, but in this particular war, it was used to refuel other fighter airplanes. It was chosen for the president today simply because it has 4 seats to fit the president, a Secret Service agent, and an extra pilot, although we are told that the president was in control of this flight for most of the time. It was an impressive sight from the deck of the Abraham Lincoln, this wartime president soaring overhead. Then coming in at about 150 miles an hour, the first sitting president to land on a carrier felt what it was like.
That's a big rush landing on an aircraft carrier for the first time. I know it grabs your chest and you feel it.
The crew was happy to have him here.
It's an honor, the greatest honor, I guess, can be bestowed on us.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good for the boat, you know what I'm saying, to experience something like that since we've been out to sea for 10 months already.
According to his pilot, the president took controls of the plane for most of the flight before handing them back over for the landing. Repressed. He became a kid. He just enjoyed that flight like very few things he's done recently. He was clearly enjoying the moment. He moved through the crowds of sailors, shaking hands and posing for pictures, then went below to attend a private pilot briefing. Mr. President, you made some history today. How's the landing? Yeah. While the ship's bakers were hard at work decorating a cake for the president, he went back on deck to watch planes take off. He will sleep on board tonight and fly home tomorrow morning by helicopter. Now, you can see the helicopter behind me, Peter, that he will be leaving on. You can also notice that the ship is hardly moving anymore. They've done that to cut down on the wind for the president's speech tonight. We will get underway after that speech to get into San Diego in time tomorrow morning. Peter?
Thank you, Bob. Bob Woodruff. Tonight, the president is going to describe how the war has essentially, if not officially, ended. ABC's Terry Moran is in San Diego tonight.
Well, Peter, tonight from on board the Lincoln, the president will first praise the valor of all the U.S. troops who fought in Iraq, and then he's going to try to sum up what he believes the war achieved. With a symbol of American military might as a backdrop, Mr. Bush will reiterate his argument that the war in Iraq made the nation safer. He will say the liberation of Iraq is a crucial advance in the campaign against terror. We have removed an ally of al-Qaeda and cut off a source of terrorist funding.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Thank you all very much. Admiral Kelly, Captain Card, officers and sailors of the USS Abraham Lincoln, my fellow Americans. Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. And now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing that country. In this battle, we have fought for the cause of liberty and for the peace of the world. Our nation and our coalition are proud of this accomplishment. Yet it is you, the members of the United States military, who achieved it. Operation Iraqi Freedom was carried out with a combination of precision and speed and boldness the enemy did not expect and the world had not seen before. From distant bases or ships at sea, we sent planes and missiles that could destroy an enemy division or strike a single bunker. Marines and soldiers charged to Baghdad across 350 miles of hostile ground. In one of the swiftest advances of heavy arms in history, you have shown the world the skill and the might of the American Armed Forces. This nation thanks all the members of our coalition who joined in a noble cause. We thank the armed forces of the United Kingdom, Australia, and Poland, who shared in the hardships of war. We thank all the citizens of Iraq who welcomed our troops and joined in the liberation of their own country. And tonight, I have a special word for Secretary Rumsfeld, for General Franks, and for all the men and women who wear the uniform of the United States. America is grateful for a job well done.
In 1994, in an interview, former Secretary of State Dick Cheney declared that if American troops had gone on to Baghdad in the spring of 1991, they would have been involved in a quagmire. It was prophetic words of the former Secretary of State, because what we had in Iraq was, in fact, a quagmire. Sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shia, possible involvement by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, the entrance of Al-Qaeda into the battlefield situation. Al-Qaeda in Iraq. We have Saddam Hussein loyalists, members of the Ba'ath Party, who were wedded to the idea of Hussein as leader. On the Shia side of the equation, Muqtada al-Sadr, the fiery Shia cleric, who developed a large following, and in fact an army, which he called the Mahdi Army. And finally, just simple anti-Americanism. Put all this together, and you couple it with far too few troops on the ground, and you have a recipe for disaster. And quite frankly, disaster is what we had in Iraq for several years. In no small part, we had a disaster because there was a fundamental dispute in policy at the highest levels of the Bush administration. On the one side, we have the light footprint strategy, championed by Donald Rumsfeld and Vice President Dick Cheney, as well as Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, all from the Pentagon, all from the Secretary of Defense's cabinet. On the other side of the equation, you have people like Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, arguing for more troops and a more intensive presence of those troops on the ground, instead of sallying forth from forward operating bases, Wright and others began to call for a more integrated placement of American soldiers within Iraqi society, a policy known as clear, hold, and build, a strategy first demonstrated by Colonel McMaster in the far northern city of Tel Afar. What we are going to examine now are these two very different strategies. First, we're going to examine the light footprint, the strategy that ruled the day in 2003, in 2004, in 2005, and in 2006. And then we'll look at the new strategy, implemented as part of the surge in the spring of 2007, clear, hold, and build. Let's go to the tape.
The summer of 2004 was the height of the political season. The president was running for re-election. The insurgency was still raging. The last thing the White House wanted was any more bad news from Iraq.
Top military officer in Iraq is being replaced.
The Pentagon is expected to replace
Sanchez was out.
General Ricardo Sanchez as the top.
It was time to try a new general.
General George Casey Jr. would take over from three-star Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez.
Rumsfeld reached into the Pentagon bureaucracy for a four-star general and found George Casey.
We still don't know a lot about General Casey. He is one of the most anonymous senior generals in American military history.
He's second-generation Army general. His father was a general who died in Vietnam. He goes out to Iraq, yet he's never led troops in combat.
Here's a guy in charge of the biggest American war since Vietnam, and nobody knows who he is.
You can name any major war that the United States has been in, and the principal generals will pop out. General Grant, General Patton, General MacArthur, Eisenhower, Westmoreland, Abrams, Casey.
Rumsfeld had a new exit strategy. Casey was ordered to minimize American casualties, to train and shift responsibility to the Iraqi army ASAP.
The objective is to get Iraq under control at a basic level, train up Iraqi security forces, turn over responsibility to the government, and leave.
Our strategy can be summed up this way. As the Iraqis stand up, we will stand down.
Standing up the new Iraqi force would take years. Until then, Casey would have to keep the lid on without adding more American troops.
Rumsfeld's prescription was to reduce the footprint, not to step up our efforts to win.
The challenges are gigantic. You're trying to stand up an army, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious army, in a country that never had much of a national identity to begin with, and you're trying to do that in the middle of a very, very violent insurgency. No small work.
At his headquarters at Camp Victory just outside Baghdad, Casey put Rumsfeld's light footprint idea into action. The American force would retreat to large bases and only engage the insurgents when absolutely necessary.
You had war tourism, units based on big forward operating bases, FOBs, going out and doing patrols from Humvees, usually not foot patrols but mounted patrols, and then coming back to their base. But if that's the way you're operating, you're not in the war, you're simply a war tourist.
When you look back on that and analyze it, it's a short war strategy. Nowhere in there is a plan to defeat the insurgency. So we had no military strategy to defeat the insurgency.
And almost immediately, there was a challenge to the light footprint strategy. It came from the Shiite cleric, Muqtada al-Sadr. Al-Sadr's militia had taken up arms in the holy city of Najaf and controlled part of the city.
The challenge to the new coalition authority was such that it really couldn't be ignored.
He had set up his headquarters inside the shrine of Imam Ali Mosque, daring the Americans to attack. Did.
I actually was with the Mahdi army when this battle was going on. And the Americans were kind of, just dropping bombs literally right next to the shrine and just kind of wiping out the Mahdi army.
Al-Sadr was surrounded. But the White House didn't want to risk destroying the mosque. They ordered Casey to cut a deal.
I don't think it was ever called a ceasefire or a peace agreement, but essentially it was. Sadr agreed to have his militia not oppose the Americans. We bought back a lot of weapons from his militia, and that part of Baghdad became very peaceful.
The payoff to Al-Sadr was substantial. Casey spent $1.2 million buying back some weapons and $330 million more in what were called reconstruction funds. They hoped they had bought some peace and quiet.
4 car bombs went off almost simultaneously this morning.
The attacks came during the busy Baghdad commute.
Now the threat was from the Sunni insurgents.
At least 31 people have been killed in a huge car bomb attack.
Everything in their back.
Ground Zero was familiar territory for the American military. Fallujah.
Fallujah becomes a kind of sanctuary for insurgents, for radicals, for al-Qaeda elements in Iraq.
Bomb factory after bomb factory after bomb factory. I mean, they were just making the car bombs and shipping them to Baghdad.
The problem that Casey faces, and his advisors are telling him, is you're not going to be able to hold elections here as long as Fallujah's there.
Throughout the fall of 2004, Casey waited. Everyone on his staff knew Fallujah was on the agenda. They just didn't know when.
I want to thank my superb campaign team. I want to thank the architect, Karl Rove.
4 days later, Casey gave a green light for the attack on Fallujah.
Tonight, Iraqi security and coalition forces kicked off offensive operations in Fallujah.
We went in to Fallujah at about 10 p.m. and the fighting started immediately. It's pitch black outside, and we all started piling out of the troop carriers. We went in on foot, see the RPGs sailing out of the city towards us. And I thought, my God, what have we gotten into here?
The battle raged for 10 days.
Fallujah, too, first of all, is an extraordinarily difficult and violent battle. I think the most intense combat U.S. forces had seen, certainly since the Vietnam War.
Much of the city was simply flattened by the attack.
Fallujah is, at that point, a victory for the United States.
The city was basically destroyed after that.
There was jubilation among many of the commanders. They believed the insurgency had been irreparably harmed.
With the liberation of Fallujah, they no longer have any safe havens anywhere in Iraq. And it was driven home to them that they cannot defeat the coalition forces.
I think there's a resurgence of optimism and that the worst is behind us.
In the battle for Fallujah, the terrorists hid weapons in the cemetery. They hid ammunition in private homes. They hid bombs in mosques, but they could not hide from the United States Marines.
In Washington that winter, the Battle of Fallujah was considered a success. The president had been re-elected, and now it was time to clean house.
I think the discord within the foreign policy inner circle around Bush is very, very high. It became personal between Powell and Cheney. It also became personal between Powell and Rumsfeld.
I think these guys have rubbed each other wrong for a long time. Just a different outlook, a different history. Just a different approach.
Secretary Powell had previously told the president that he, the secretary, didn't believe the national security team was working, that you had some square pegs in a round hole, that he should leave or Don should leave or both of them should leave, but there needed to be some changes.
they went off to Camp David, Bush, Rice, Andy Card, to talk about new cabinet appointments.
The president's chief of staff, Andy Card, strongly recommended the president fire Rumsfeld. Rice agreed. But the vice president defended his longtime ally and friend.
When they got back, Powell got a call from Andy Card saying, well, Colin, the president's decided to make a change, and you're it. This was on a Wednesday. He got this call. He said, we want your resignation letter by Friday. Powell didn't tell anybody. He went home. He typed it himself.
Please be seated. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to announce my nomination of Dr. Condoleezza Rice to be America's Secretary of State.
Powell was out. Rice was in. Rumsfeld had survived.
7 November, go.
In January of 2005, Iraq was about to hold its very first general election. One question concerned the Americans. Would the fallout from the bloody Battle of Fallujah cause the Sunnis to boycott the election?
I got up that morning at 7 o'clock, went out on the streets, and there was no vehicular traffic allowed anywhere in the country.
It was a day of...
So the streets were empty. I remember thinking, oh my God, no one's going to come out to vote. People started to trickle out. By 10:30 in the morning, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people out to vote.
The stories that started coming in about millions of Iraqis lining up to vote were quite encouraging.
It was a really extraordinary thing, people wearing their best clothes, husbands and wives with their children, people lining up.
And the pictures of the people with the purple fingers started to be broadcast around.
There were celebrations, but something important had been overlooked.
If you look at the January election, it was a big turnout, but the Sunnis didn't vote.
As the votes were being counted, Casey's inner circle knew there was a problem.
The effects of the Sunni boycott were available reasonably soon.
We never imagined that a boycott by the Sunni Arabs could be that complete. It appears that overall Sunni Arab turnout was probably about 10%.
Everybody understood very quickly we'd elected a government that divided the country. And everyone who had to work in the green zone or the area knew that beneath this political structure there was a virtual vacuum.
And so in that vacuum, the insurgency began to step back up in an effort to undermine that political process and undermine the legitimacy of the new government.
When we did not secure the population, the enemy realized that the population was fair game. We were securing them. The Iraqis couldn't do it yet. So what did? They began to kill people.
We're following reports today of 2 suicide bombings.
The administration told a different story.
The level of activity that we see today from a military standpoint, I think, will clearly decline. I think they're in the last throes, if you will, of the insurgency.
The victory of freedom in Iraq will strengthen a new ally.
The rhetoric that the president was evidencing in his remarks, he would use terms like win, we're going to defeat the insurgents, victory. That all would lend itself to a military strategy whose purpose was to defeat the insurgency. We never had that as a mission in Iraq.
Instead, Rumsfeld and Casey were sticking to their light footprint strategy, staying bases, not going out to defeat the insurgency. The new Secretary of State would immediately challenge that strategy. In her first public appearances, she sent a different message. U.S. troops might be in Iraq for a long time to come.
So the message
message should be to the Iraqi people: we intend to finish the job.
I really believe that we should not try and put artificial timetables on this. We need to finish the job. My response to all of the talk about what we might do is to say, let's do the job.
In another move, Rice even sent one of her closest confidants to Iraq.
I ended up going to Iraq about a dozen times over a couple of years.
It's unusual for a Secretary of State to be obtaining his or her own military assessment of events.
Zelikow found Casey and Rumsfeld's light footprint and reliance on Iraqi forces wanting.
It seemed to be a strategy, the dominant theme of which this is an exit strategy, and then the objective of an exit strategy is to exit. And then you don't really develop any strategy for success independent of exit.
Phil Zelikow begins to write her increasingly alarmist and bleak memos. He's increasingly aggravated and frustrated by Rumsfeld, who he feels, rightly, just wants to get the troops out.
It was in northern Iraq that Zelikow would find a strategy for victory that he could support.
The situation when we got into Tal Afar was very bleak. The enemy had essentially established control over the city. This was sort of a franchise operation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Colonel H.R. McMaster's approach was to systematically clear sections of the city. Then, U.S. troops stayed and secured the population and focused on rebuilding. It was known as clear, hold, and build.
It meant having outposts across the city, so that your good intentions were backed up by actions. The people who allied themselves with you were not then killed when they went home, because you had troops out there watching for insurgents and protecting people.
What is amazing is, once you are able to lift the pall of fear off of these populations, how life just flows back into these cities. But what's important is to keep security there, because we're battling a very ruthless, a murderous enemy who's determined to come back into these areas.
The lesson of Tal Afar was that you had to be in the city among the population, living there in small units.
McMaster's clear, hold, and build approach was a significant departure from U.S. military strategy.
It was suggestive of what was possible with a lot of investment of effort and manpower in a relatively small area.
He goes up to Tal Afar. He sits down with Colonel H.R. McMaster, and he actually picks up that phrase, clear, hold, and build, and says, oh, actually, there is a strategy that's working out here. It's just not anything that anybody in the Pentagon seems to be aware of.
What's remarkable about Tal Afar is, why isn't that being done in different forms all over the country?
They've retaken this city from terrorist members of Al-Qaeda in
U.S. operation.
Zelikow advised Rice clear, hold could be a strategy for victory.
My argument was that we needed to make another major push on Iraq with a much stronger and more articulated strategy to succeed and resource what it would take to succeed.
Rice decided to champion clear, hold, build before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The Secretary of State proposing military policy was a direct and very public challenge to Defense Secretary Rumsfeld.
Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice.
Our political military strategy has to be to clear, hold, and build, to clear areas from insurgent control, to hold them securely, and to build durable national Iraqi institutions.
Rumsfeld was not happy.
I heard later that the Secretary of Defense was upset, and I heard actually that General Casey was upset. That here we were trying to articulate strategy, that was their job.
There have been some critics who have said that you don't have enough troops to do this clear, hold, and build strategy.
Well, please, let me just stop right there. Anyone who takes those three words and thinks it means the United States should clear, and the United States should hold, and the United States should build, doesn't understand the situation. It is the Iraqis' country. They've got 28 million people there. They are clearing, they are holding, they are building. They're to be the ones doing the reconstruction in that country. And we do not have, with 160,000 troops there, the idea that we could do that is so far from reality, nor was there any intention that we should do that.
And so a great deal has changed. The only unfortunate thing is that it took so long to change. It was not until February of 2007 the strategy of clear, hold, and build was adopted. It was not until February of 2007 that, let's be honest, the incredibly ineffectual General George Casey was replaced, and the Secretary of Defense was replaced. Donald Rumsfeld was forced to resign. In his place, Robert Gates, who is still Secretary of Defense in the new Obama administration. In place of George Casey was David Petraeus, the man in charge of the surge, and the man responsible for turning Iraq around. Well, we are certainly not out of the woods yet. The situation there, now 1 year, now 2.5 years after the surge began, is much, much better than it was at any time between 2003 and February of 2007. The price we have paid has been enormous. As of this lecture, as of July 2009, 4,316 Americans have died. So we can see from this graph the casualty numbers peaking in the early months of 2007 have significantly declined. The black line there marks essentially the beginning of the change in strategy now, where the surge is working. But this is only one side of the story, those killed in action. Because the number of wounded soldiers is astronomical. In the Vietnam War, 53,000 Americans died, 158,000 were wounded. It means for every death there were 3 soldiers wounded. In this war, that ratio is much, much higher. Battlefield medicine has saved many, many lives that otherwise would have lost. Now that said, it also means that soldiers are surviving catastrophic injuries, catastrophic brain injuries, the loss of multiple limbs because of improvised explosive devices by the side of the road. Though many, many more soldiers are surviving, their quality of life upon coming home nowhere near what it was when they left. Moreover, one thing that's not included in this graph are the number of psychological injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder, shell shock, as it was once known. Hundreds of thousands of young men have come back mentally scarred, and unfortunately many of those have not received the proper mental health treatment that they earned and deserve. From a financial perspective, the cost of this war is astronomical. As of July 2009, the approximate cost to date is $1 trillion. 1,000 billion dollars. And after all, the massive stimulus bill was $767 billion. This is fully 33% more than the stimulus cost. $1 trillion. And of course, the war's not over. We still have 135,000 combat troops in Iraq. The war is not over. Unfortunately, our fiscal situation is perilous. This graph here charts our national debt, which is the amount of money we spend above and beyond what we take in through taxes. Throughout much of U.S. history, the debt has been nominal. However, beginning with World War II, we began to ring up bills that we were not paying off. As we can see here, the overwhelming majority of our debt, however, has been incurred since the beginning of the Ronald Reagan administration in 1980. When Reagan took office, we had approximately $1.5 trillion in debt, in today's money. Today, that number has surpassed $12 trillion in debt. We've seen the sharpest increase in our debt during the 8 years of President George W. Bush's presidency. This is a problem. We have written many, many, many checks that we simply cannot ever cash. I don't know what the answer here is, kids. It's grim. It's very, very grim.